Hello and welcome to our Case for a Creator study. Today, we are going to be starting the next section. And so we're going to be looking at the Big Bang. And this is going to be part one because this chapter is like 50 pages. And so I think it's important that we break it down into smaller chunks. Basically, this chapter goes through the Kalam cosmological argument and explains how the Big Bang is evidence for creation. So, um, let's see, last time we, this, last time we were answering objections from, so we saw the last couple weeks, actually, we've been discussing where faith and science meet. We've been seeing that science and faith are actually companions. They are not rivals, and they don't oppose one another. And we finished that off by talking about the goal that we would come into a new age of science in which all available evidence is examined, not just the evidence that meshes well with particular interpretations. And then, so today we're going to start the process of examining these things more deeply by talking about the beginning of the universe in what is often called by scientists the Big Bang. Now, before we get too far into it, I do just want to remind you guys, if you love what we do here at Freed Indeed Ministries, including the YouTube channel, but also everything else that we're doing, the counseling and all of it, feel free to head down to the link in the description below and support the channel. I also encourage everyone who's able to do so to follow the link I have for the Orthodox Diocese of Alaska so that you can be supporting the great work that they are doing. So now, with all that out of the way, let's take a look at the Big Bang. So I'm going to let the two quotes that Lee Strobel has here be our introduction to this new section that we are embarking on. The evidence of cosmology beginning with a bang. So it says, set aside the many competing explanations of the Big Bang. Something made an entire cosmos out of nothing. It is this realization that something transcendent started it all, which has hard science types using terms like miracle. That's journalist Greg Easterbrook. Here's another quote. Perhaps the best argument that the Big Bang supports theism is the obvious unease with which it is greeted by some atheist physicists. At times, this has led to scientific ideas being abandoned with a tendency which so exceeds their intrinsic worth that one can only suspect the operation of psychological forces lying very much deeper than the usual academic desire of a theorist to support his or her theory. That's from astrophysicist C.J. Isham. So the Big Bang as evidence for theism, and we see in these two quotes a couple of things right off the bat. The first is that the Big Bang seems intuitively to comport with theism because it draws from the lips of even the most hardened skeptics words like miracle. And then we see that the Big Bang seems to comport better with theism than atheism because, unlike many other scientific discoveries, it has resulted in a lot of chagrin and difficulty among people of an atheistic bent. So let's begin at the beginning because it's a very good place to begin. The question that we're sort of looking at here is, where did everything come from? We might also ask it as, why is there something rather than nothing? And how did the universe begin? How has um, how has there come to be a universe in the first place? Now, the Bible claims to answer this question right in Genesis chapter 1, which says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We see God saying, let there be light, and there was light. And this is how the universe begins according to Scripture. But we might ask ourselves, is this scriptural account simply superstition? Is it simply religious mumbo jumbo? Or is this actual history? And on page 114 of our book, we read the following. In the beginning, there was an explosion, explained Nobel Prize winning physicist Steven Weinberg in his book, The First 3 Minutes. Not just an explosion like those familiar on Earth, starting from a definite center and spreading out to engulf more and more of the circumambient air, but an explosion which occurred simultaneously everywhere, filling all space from the beginning, with every particle of matter rushing apart from every other particle. Within the tiniest split second, the temperature hit 100,000 million degrees centigrade. This is much hotter than the center of even the hottest star. So hot, in fact, that none of the components of ordinary matter, molecules or atoms, or even nuclei of atoms could have held together. The matter rushing apart consisted of such elementary particles as negatively charged electrons, positively charged positrons, and neutrons, which lack both electrical charge and mass. Interestingly, there were also photons. The universe, he said, was filled with light. So, in the first 3 minutes, 98% of all matter that exists or ever would exist filled the universe all at once in an instant. So calling this an explosion is perhaps a little bit of a oversimplification, but the point is that this is the way in which it happened. Um, The most intriguing question is what caused the universe to suddenly spring into existence. For Bryson and many others, its mere presence somehow seems to explain itself. In a chapter called How to Build a Universe, he vaguely speculates on exotic theories about a false vacuum or a scalar field or vacuum energy, some sort of quality or thing that may have introduced a measure of instability into the nothingness. Oh my goodness, and thus sparked the Big Bang, through which emerged the universe. So, um, I love when these atheists say these things like unstable nothingness or introduced instability into nothingness. Nothing is not stable or unstable because it is nothing. Nothing is nothing. It is no thing. It does not exist. It is the absence of existence. So when you say there is nothing, and then you say that that nothing is unstable, that you've already stopped making sense. So here's another quote comparison. And I want you to listen to these two statements and then honestly ask yourself which of these two statements is more rational. It seems impossible that you could get something from nothing, says Bryson, but the fact that there was nothing and now there is a universe is evident proof that you can. Well, there you go. It's just a self-evident theory, isn't it? It's just you can just say whatever you want and just declare it to be true. Well, here's another quote. This is from Edward Milne. As to the first cause of the universe, that is left to the reader to insert, but our own picture is incomplete without him. Him. Our picture is incomplete without him. So, um, honestly ask yourself which of these conceptions makes more sense. Does it make more sense to say the universe exists, therefore it must have the possibility of just existing? We never see abiogenesis anywhere else. We never see something come from nothing anywhere else, but it must have happened because it happened according to my theory. Or does it make more sense to posit that there is, in fact, a transcendent, all powerful being who created the universe? Which of those two things is more rational? As we explore this, I want to call your attention to a book by Stuart C. Hackett. That book is called The Resurrection of Theism. Despite the fact that this is an excellent book, it was never a bestseller. Um, for obvious reasons, it's very technical and it's very deeply philosophical, but I highly recommend this book. I believe that every apologist should read it, and I believe that every skeptic should read it. Everyone who claims to be a skeptic, everyone who claims to be an atheist, and has a desire to honestly examine the case for theism, I think, should take the time to read this book. But one of the art I bring up this book because one of the arguments that this book makes is in fact that since the universe had a beginning, it had to have had a beginner. It had to have had a God who created it. Now you might think that that argument isn't a good argument, but at least examine the argument within the text of the book and and see for yourself. But interestingly, this book highly influenced a man named William Lane Craig, who is a scholar, philosopher, and apologist, and who, through his studies of the sciences, had actually become very skeptical and was himself, I think he says he was agnostic, not really an atheist, but more like an agnostic. But he read this book, The Resurrection of Theism by Hackett, and because he read this book, he was actually really highly influenced, especially by this idea that if the universe had a beginning, then it had to have someone who began it. And because he was so highly influenced by this, he actually devoted his life to it and became an apologist. We read here, oh, as far as Hackett goes, Hackett is a brilliant thinker who took theistic arguments seriously, rigorously defending them from every objection he could find or imagine. One argument in the book was that the universe must have had a beginning and therefore a creator. William Lane Craig was so intrigued by that he decided to use his doctoral studies under British theologian John Hick to come to a resolution in his own mind concerning the soundness of this argument. Would it really withstand scrutiny? Craig ended up writing his dissertation on the topic, an exercise that launched him into a lifetime of exploring cosmology. And then it introduces William Lane Craig, showing all of his academic achievements. I'm not going to read all that. You can get this from Wikipedia or William Lane Craig's bio, or even from reading this very book. So I'm not going to take the time to go through all of that. a member of 9 professional societies, including the American Philosophical Association, the Science and Religion Forum, the American Scientific Affiliation, and the Philosophy of Time Society. Craig currently is a research professor at the Talbot School of Theology. So, yeah, William Lane Craig was highly influenced by Hackett and has become a very prominent figure in the world of apologetics. Now, I have to make a note here because I know that William Lane Craig is very controversial, and I myself have actually critiqued his ideas in the past and have critiqued a lot of problems with his presentations in the past. So he's a very good apologist. He's very good at refuting atheism, for example, but he's a very bad theologian. He's really not a good representation of what Christians should believe about God. He's very good at arguing for a general theism, though. For one thing, he subscribes to so here some of the issues with William Lane Craig are that he subscribes to something called Molinism, which I have a whole video on, so you can watch that. I'm not going to take a bunch of time to discuss it here. And he also subscribes to monothelitism, which I have discussed elsewhere as well. So I highly recommend um, if this series is helping to convince you to become a theist and you're examining the different options before you, so to speak, of what is true or false, I highly recommend going and watching those videos that I've done. And if you're already a person who thinks of yourself as a Christian, I highly recommend watching those videos so that you can understand better how not to fall into these things that our friend Will Craig here has fallen into. But like I said, I've already critiqued this worldview, so I'm not going to spend tons of time on it here. So this might bring up the question, okay, so why use his work? Well, the reason is because first off, we need to be able to learn from people with whom we disagree. In modern American culture, it's very common to just sort of have this mentality of cancel culture, where as soon as somebody says something you disagree with, you just want them to be banned from public forum. And that's not right. We don't do that. Instead, we examine people's arguments. Remember, I bring this up a lot, but recall that when I did my show going through the book The Soul After Death, we examined lots of non-Christian sources and examined and compared and contrasted the different views, the different worldviews to see what is true. You have this is part of honest investigation. This is part of honest discussion. Cheryl and I last night watched the movie Dolores Claiborne, which is an awesome movie, and I highly recommend it. But one of the reasons why I love to recommend the movie Dolores Claiborne is because it's a good example of why we shouldn't jump to conclusions. The detective in the movie, who's kind of the villain of the movie, he's not necessarily a terrible person. He's not even necessarily a bad cop per se. However, he's become fixated on the idea that Dolores Claiborne is guilty, and because he's so fixated on this idea, he is not able to see reason anymore. He's not able to see the he's not able to see the truth anymore, even if it's right in front of him, because he's guided only by his passion to try to bring this woman to justice for a crime he believes she's committed. In other words, he has acquired tunnel vision over the years. And I think in a lot of ways, we all can be the same way. We develop a theory, we develop a worldview, and then we get tunnel vision. We can't see the evidence that doesn't match with that worldview, and we have to fight that tendency. So, right off the bat, that's one reason why it's important for us to examine William Lane Craig's work. Another thing is that not every theist is going to be a Christian, and not every person who is a member of any given church is going to be a true Christian who truly loves the Lord and worships him aright. We know this because Jesus himself said that the wheat would grow with the tares. So the tares and the wheat grow up together. Um, so not every theist is going to be a Christian. And that doesn't mean that their arguments are bad. That doesn't mean that they don't have good arguments for what they're claiming. So you need to be able to examine their arguments and discern what are the best arguments. And at Freed Indeed Ministries, I believe in using the best arguments and the best evidence from various perspectives. But in this case, this book, The Case for a Creator, is not about so much proving Christianity specifically, but about the proving the worldview of theism, proving a theistic worldview to be true in general. And then from that, we then move to proving Christianity. So this book is more about refuting, say, atheism and agnosticism than about refuting, say, Islam. So that means that if a Muslim has a good argument against atheism, it's a good idea for us to use that argument to refute atheism. If a Buddhist has a good argument against um, against other things, we use that argument. If and obviously, ideally, we would be getting all of our things from within a Christian framework, but the Christian worldview is robust and strong enough to interact with these things from other worldviews. So that's why we use that's why we use William Lane Craig's arguments. And so with that said, if you want to do a better job than William Lane Craig, and you want to use stronger arguments and stronger presentation that are from an Orthodox Christian perspective, then I encourage you, write your dissertation, write your book. The beauty of what we're doing here is that it can be built upon and strengthened, and I trust that we will continue to do just that. So, with that said, let's get into the Kalam cosmological argument. So, the Kalam cosmological argument was first kind of formulated by a Christian philosopher named John Philoponus in Alexandria, Egypt. But after Egypt was conquered by Islam later on in history, Philoponus's arguments were carried on and developed by Islamic scholars in a school of thought called Kalam. Now, the medieval Islamic school of Kalam has died out, but the Kalam cosmological argument remains. And, once again, it's useful to study these materials, use what is valuable and good, chew on the meat, and then spit out the bones. So, the Kalam cosmological argument goes something like this. First premise, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Second premise, the universe began to exist. And then conclusion, therefore, if both of these premises are true, then the universe must have had a cause. So today we are for this series, we're going to start by examining that first premise. So the basic argument hasn't really changed, but Lee Strobel presents the first kind of objection or study point. I spoke up. Obviously, none of these early philosophers knew about any of the scientific evidence for the origin of the universe. How did they argue that the universe had a beginning? So William Lane Craig replies by saying they relied on philosophical and mathematical reasoning. However, when scientists in the last century began to discover hard data about the Big Bang, this provided a more empirical foundation for the argument. So the basic argument hasn't changed. What has changed is the amount of corroborating evidence. We now have a lot more evidence from various disciplines like math and science that show us that the universe had a beginning and therefore a cause. So let's work through this a little bit. The first premise really shouldn't be controversial. When I first began to defend the Kalam argument, Craig said, I anticipated that its first premise, that whatever begins to exist has a cause, would be accepted by virtually everyone. I thought the second premise, that the universe began to exist, would be much more controversial, but the scientific evidence has accumulated to such an extent that atheists are finding it very difficult to deny that the universe had a beginning, so they've been forced to attack the first premise instead. At that, Craig shook his head, saying, to me, this is absolutely bewildering. It seems metaphysically necessary that anything which begins to exist has to have a cause that brings it into existence. Things don't just pop into existence, uncaused out of nothing. Yet the atheist Quentin Smith concluded our book on the topic by claiming that the most reasonable belief is that we came from nothing, by nothing, and for nothing. That sounds like a good conclusion to the Gettysburg Address of atheism. It simply amazes me that anyone can think that is the most rational view. Generally, people who take this position don't try to prove the premise is false because they can't do that. Instead, they fold their arms and play the skeptic by saying you can't prove that it's true. They dial the degree of skepticism so high that nothing could possibly convince them. So this view really shouldn't be controversial. The fact that people are arguing against the idea that whatever begins to exist has a cause shows the level of determination that they have to just being skeptics for skepticism's sake. But I would like to take a moment to simply reflect on the fact that this shows that we are winning the debate. This shows that we are that the evidence is in our favor because they can't really debate premise 2 anymore, so they have to come up with completely irrational and illogical things to say about premise 1. And that's all that they can really do because premise 2 is so well established by the science. So let's go a little bit deeper though. So now Lee Strobel kind of challenges William Lane Craig, saying, don't they have every right to play the skeptic? After all, the burden of proof should be on you to present an affirmative case. And that is true. However, as Craig points out, we shouldn't demand unreasonable standards of proof. So if you're saying that, and also you are making I would turn that around on them and say, okay, well, then show me any proof that things do in fact come into existence out of nothing. Where's the proof of that premise that things come to existence out of nothing by themselves? Show me proof of that. They can't prove that premise. So, and it seems much more intuitively obvious that um whatever begins to exist does in fact have a cause, and that's where we're going to go now. So Lee Strobel asks, what positive proof can you offer? And the first is critical thinking. William Lane Craig says, in the first place, this first premise is intuitively obvious once you clearly grasp the concept of absolute nothing. You see, the idea that things can come into being uncaused out of nothing is worse than magic. At least when a magician pulls a rabbit out of a hat, there's a magician and a hat. But in atheism, the universe just pops into being out of nothing with absolutely no explanation at all. I think once people understand the concept of absolute nothingness, it is simply obvious to them that if something has a beginning, it could not have popped into existence out of nothing, but must have had a cause that brings it into existence. So it's intuitively obvious. And I would also point out that it accords with literally all observable evidence. You never see things popping into existence out of nothing. Every observable piece of evidence we have indicates to us that this premise is in fact true. And that's kind of where we're going. So we certainly have empirical evidence for the truth of this premise. This is a principle that is constantly confirmed and never falsified. We never see things coming into being uncaused out of nothing. Nobody worries that while he's away at work, say, a horse might pop into being uncaused out of nothing in his living room and be there defiling his carpet. We don't worry about these kinds of things because they never happen. So this is a principle that is constantly verified by science. At least you have to admit that we have more reason to think that it is true than that it is false. If you're presented with a principle and its denial, which way does the evidence point? Obviously, the premise is more plausible than its denial is. So, this is something that is constantly verified, never falsified, and that's about as scientific as you can get. So far, the idea that everything that comes into being has a cause, or everything that is caused has a cause. There's no such thing as an uncaused cause. This premise is clearly manifested in the world around us. But in the wacky realm of quantum physics, there is one place where this is sort of challenged a bit. Lee Strobel says, still, my research had yielded one substantive objection to Kalam's first presence. It emanates from the wacky world of quantum physics, where all kinds of strange and unexpected things happen at a subatomic level. A level, by the way, at which the entire universe existed at its very earliest stages. Maybe our commonplace understandings of cause and effect don't apply to this circus mirror environment of quantum weirdness, a place where science writer Timothy Ferris writes the logical foundations of classical science are sometimes violated. Here's a quote from Discover magazine. Quantum theory holds that a vacuum is subject to quantum uncertainties. This means that things can materialize out of the vacuum, although they tend to vanish back into it rather quickly. Theoretically, anything, a dog, a house, a planet, can pop into existence by means of this quantum quirk, which physicists call a vacuum fluctuation. Probability, however, dictates that pairs of subatomic particles are by far the most likely creations that will last extremely briefly. Spontaneous, persistent creation of something even as large as a molecule, is profoundly unlikely. Nevertheless, in 1973, an assistant professor at Columbia University named Edward Tryon suggested that the entire universe might have come into existence this way. This whole universe might be a free lunch. So, do these quantum particles come into existence? And if so, doesn't that demonstrate that the entire universe could theoretically have come into existence in this way? So, we might have to ask Ant-Man this question because he's been to the quantum universe. But in the meantime, since we can't ask Ant-Man, the first thing we should note is that this is just a theory. It's not actually a fact. It's not actually something scientists have observed. It's something that they've theorized, that some quantum physicists theorize is possible. It's not something that's ever been observed. So it's not clear whether these particles actually exist or ever have. This may not be the only, this isn't the only argument, and I don't necessarily think it's the best argument, but it is worth noting that this is a highly theoretical realm in which we're exploring when we talk about this, and there's no reason to think that this is actually fact. But more importantly, if we say for the sake of argument that this is actually what's happening, William Lane Craig responds here. However, there's a much more important point to be made about this. You see, these particles, if they even are real, do not come out of nothing. The quantum vacuum is not what most people envision when they think of a vacuum. That is absolutely nothing. On the contrary, it's a sea of fluctuating energy, an arena of violent activity that has a rich physical structure and can be described by physical laws. These particles are thought to originate by fluctuations of energy in the vacuum. So it's not an example of something coming into being out of nothing or something coming into being without a cause. The quantum vacuum and the energy locked up in the vacuum are the cause of these particles, if they exist. And then we would have to ask, well, what is the origin of the whole quantum vacuum itself? Where does it come from? You've simply pushed back the issue of creation. Now you've got to account for how this very active ocean of fluctuating energy came into being. You see what I'm saying? If quantum physical laws operate within the domain described by quantum physics, you can't legitimately use quantum physics to explain the origin of that domain itself. You need something transcendent that's beyond that domain in order to explain how the entire domain came into being. Suddenly, we're back to the origins question all over again. So this is the twofold problem with this argument. First, the quantum vacuum is the cause of these particles if they exist because of what a quantum vacuum is. And he explained that better than I will, so I'll just leave that. But the second is that you have to account for this quantum vacuum itself. Its very existence is actually a problem for the atheist because if this quantum vacuum exists, then it came into being. And if it came, since we know that there was nothing before and then there was something, even if you're saying, well, once there was something, it started out as a quantum vacuum, that doesn't explain where the quantum vacuum itself came from. Even historic skeptics like David Hume have actually challenged this idea that something can come into existence out of nothing. David Hume wrote in 1754, "I never asserted so absurd a proposition as that anything might arise without a cause." And then William Lane Craig says, "It wasn't until the discovery of scientific confirmation for the beginning of the universe in the 20th century that people began to say, well, maybe the universe just popped into existence out of nothing. Nobody has defended such an absurd position historically. which again makes me inclined to think this is just a corner they've been backed into by the evidence for the beginning of the universe. So I think we've pretty well established that anything that has a cause has a cause, that anything that is caused has a cause. This is true by definition. It's what's called a tautology. And so even skeptics like David Hume wouldn't challenge this idea. It's kind of a corner that people have been backed into in order to preserve a sense of skepticism that may not be warranted. At some point, you just have to accept that a premise has enough evidence to support it. Now we're going to stop there for this week because I like to keep these videos to a manageable length. I think we have been given a lot to think about here. And next week, I want to move on to the second argument in the second premise in the Kalam argument. But in the meantime, as always, I want to leave you with this thought. Yes, the universe does have an origin, and that origin is the Lord Jesus Christ. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And Jesus Christ, that God became man so that we can know him. And so I would urge you to come and see, come and check out the Orthodox Church, come and have your question, come and ask your questions and have them answered in the Orthodox Church. Come and see. Come and see what God can do in your life. See the transformation that God is willing and delighted to make in your life, and come and see his incredible love that he has for you. Don't just learn facts about the fact that the universe has a beginning, or the fact that if the universe has a beginning, that must mean that there's a creator. Those are good. That's a good starting point, but don't stop there. Pursue this line of inquest to where it's leading, which is to the Lord Jesus Christ, and come and receive him today. So thank you very much for watching. Please do leave a like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. And most importantly, share this with your friends, especially your atheist and agnostic friends, so that they too can be freed indeed.